Welcome to another episode of these conversations with scientists in first responder work and also in the medical community. And today I'm talking with Vicky LeBlanc. Is that correct pronunciation?
It's perfect. Yes.
So I have to warm up with my English a little bit every time I talk in English. You are a chair and full professor in the Department of Innovation in Medical Education in Ottawa.
Yes.
Can you give some little bit background to especially the people listening from the medical community of the Netherlands?
Of myself. Yeah. So by training, I'm a cognitive psychologist. So very interested in sort of how people pay attention and what they remember and make decisions. And I got interested in the topic of emotions, I would say over 20 years ago when I worked with our air ambulance system here in Ontario. And started noticing that you could have, very highly capable individuals that could work in very uncontrolled environments. Um, but as soon as we put them in the simulator and something that was uncontrolled that had sort of social evaluative stress, we saw that things would go a little different. And so that just ignited a passion for what was this thing called stress? What was this thing called emotions? And so I started a program of research around that, and then got really heavily involved in simulation-based education for health professionals. And again, we'd have a lot of conversations around emotions there. And there was sort of this discomfort of how do we deal with emotions? Do we let them go? Do we try to trigger them? How do we make sure we don't break the fragile learners and stuff? And so that led to these two articles to say, well, I know a little bit about this and let's go delve into it and see how we can use it to be able to understand it and support our learners. So it's been a long process of work in it, but a lot of passion and love into it.
Great. And you work also with Victoria Brazil. I had her two times on the podcast and about this topic also, simulation training and so on. And for a little bit context, we here in the Netherlands, I started within the police with stress exposure training. I later developed what I called stress exposure simulation training. And then we did this also in the medical community with ambulance. We have a
Okay.
two-day training program and lately with in hospital with doctors and nurses. But I also wanted to have a fast scientific background. So there is research about stress exposure training, and there is research about simulation training. But this is about stress, and now we're talking about emotion.
Hmm.
So I came on your articles, and the first one is Emotions in Simulation-Based Education, Friends or Foes of Learning, was a great article. And then the latest article was this one, and it was More Than a Feeling, Emotional Regulation Strategies for Simulation-Based Education. So me and my colleagues, we have those doctors and nurses in our stress simulation training, and we want them to have a great learning experience. But how to deal with emotion? And that's the topic of your article, of course.
Yeah.
Is it possible to first talk about more than a feeling, about
Sure.
what you did there, and after that maybe looking a little bit in, is there a difference in stress and emotion, and what is stress? Is stress an emotion, and how to deal with stress and so on?
Right, right. Going into the tough questions. Yeah, so yeah, I'm happy to talk about the more than a
Yeah.
feeling. And so the purpose of that paper, I mean, that paper was a direct sort of sequel to the Motions and Simulation Friends Foes. And the reason that it came is like I said, in doing a lot of simulation, we have the privilege of being able to create the learning environments that we want to do, that we can say, okay, we can target something exactly to what we think the objectives are and the learners will do. And a lot of time we try to develop something that's right at the edge of their knowledge or their competencies. And so that necessarily brings a lot of emotions, especially because they know that they're being observed. They know that there's going to be conversations around that. And and so a lot of my colleagues would recognize that we're triggering strong emotions with it, and so partly were conversations that would come up to me and say, hey, I had a learner cry in my session the other day. I had somebody that got angry with me. Are we doing some damage to them? And then I'd hear the other side of individuals that would come in and say, well, we can use simulation to really expose them to these kind of emotions because they need to learn how to deal with it. And there was sort of the two areas, as some people say, if we're going to be psychologically safe, we can't trigger discomfort, right? We're kind of failing our learners if we do this. And the other side is, well, we put them under pressure, they're going to learn to deal with it. And most people were in the middle. And so we'd have conversations and I'd be like, well, this is how you want to think about it. That's not good or bad. You want to normalize it. And at one point, a colleague said, well, you need to put this in a paper so that we can have something that we can refer to and that we can learn and then we can see where it would go from. And so the first paper, which was the one that the older paper was more just kind of laying out this idea of emotions aren't good or bad, or how do we have to think about it? And then the questions are like, okay, but now, Vicky, what do we do about it? And how do we recognize the different emotions? And so that's the latest paper, More Than a Feeling. And Vic Brazel joined us for that one because she has a lot of firsthand experience in doing stress exposure, emotion exposure simulations in Australia. And so we started chatting about what would be really a helpful paper of it. And that was describing what are emotions, what emotions do, giving people a little bit of insight into the different emotions and basically what their function is and what it is that they do so that people could recognize, is this an emotion that's going to be helpful for learning or is it going to be detrimental? And then giving them a set of tools or strategies that they could apply when they're in situations, say, okay, these emotions are a little too activated or they're not aligned to the goals of the situation. And not necessarily to give them a recipe, but to give them some strategies that they could try when they find themselves in that situation of like, this isn't beneficial for learning. How do I support this learner and how do I get them to learn strategies that are going to be helpful?
Great. And although I wasn't intended to do it, I feel compelled to discuss the difference between stress and emotions a
Yeah.
little bit because from our viewpoint here in the Netherlands, but also I think in the policing community, when we do simulation training, we do a different kinds of simulation training, of course, also skill-based and so on. But
Yeah.
we also do it for what we call mental resilience or call it stress exposure training.
Yeah.
Are we talking about the same things now?
Yeah, the field's a bit divided of that. There's a lot of people who feel that stress is a separate condition because stress can be triggered by things that are not psychological, right? You can be under things like, you can be under heat, you can be under time pressure, and so you kind of change things. So a lot of people will treat stress as sort of a separate type of category. But in a lot of ways, stress is an affective reaction like everything else, right? You appraise a situation as being, there's something that's threatening to my goals. I don't feel like I have a lot of control. I don't know that I have the resources to meet this situation. And then it triggers a physiological response, but it also triggers cognitive and behavioral and motivational. So in that way, I tend to look at stress as being having similar processes as emotions will. But because it can be triggered by other things and it has its distinct sort of patterns and outcomes, a lot of individuals tend to treat it differently. So sometimes it can be a debate. I tend to link them similarly because I think we can approach them fairly similarly in our approach in how we support our learners or give them the training that they need.
So if we talk about more than feeling and about emotional regulation strategies, we can talk it. We don't need to differentiate them from stress right now. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I mean, because one of the reactions that you have with stress is anxiety, right? And anxiety is an emotion. And so I think a lot of those strategies that we discuss in that paper could apply to stressful situations as well.
Okay, great. Well, then you start with your paper. You start with I think what are emotions? Of course, people can read the article, but can you give a short overview? What are emotions and why are they important in simulations?
Yeah. So what emotions are is they're essentially signals or states that your body uses to sort of prepare you to react to something or motivate you to do something. So what happens is you'll be in a situation where it's a situation that has implications for goals, right? So it's either good or bad. You have control, you don't have control. Either you're responsible for the situation, somebody else, and there's a whole series of appraisals that'll happen. And depending on what the result of that appraisal is, you're going to get a physiological response, physiological feelings. Your thought processes are going to change, and because what these emotions do is they essentially alert your system or inform your system to say, okay, this is something you need to pay attention to. And so they're going to marshal a lot of your cognitive behavioral resources to deal with this because this is something that's important for your survival, right? Whether it's your psychological, your social, your physical. And so then these emotions have a lot of components, right? They have cognitive components, you have thoughts, you have feelings that you're aware of, they'll have physiological patterns, they'll have behavioral patterns, your how your body is going to be different, and they're going to have motivational. And then this in turn then affects what you notice, what you pay attention to, what you're going to remember. And so I always tell people that emotions are a little bit like the weather patterns in which our body functions, right? They're always there. We're always doing these assessments of the world around us. And these assessments then inform all of these changes to say, okay, this is how we're going to deal with the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, okay, that's great. And what happens in simulation training? Because that's we talk about emotions during simulations. Can we have a concrete how do you call it, example how in a simulation emotions can arise? You talk about it in your paper also, but do you have
Mhm.
something on top of mind?
Yeah. So let's say, I mean, an obvious one that we know happens a lot in simulation is going to be anxiety, right? So you walk into a situation that you know there's either a camera or there's observers or people are behind a one-sided glass. And you know that people are specifically paying attention to you and looking at what you're doing, and then you're going to have some conversations around it after. And so that creates what we call a social evaluative stressor, right? Other people are there for the purpose of being able specifically to judge you. And that's actually one of the most powerful stressors
Yeah.
that we have as human beings because we're so dependent on social. So it could be, I'm a learner, I'm walking in and I'm having to do something that I'm not comfortable with in front of a group of 30 of my classmates, and I'm not comfortable with it. And as I'm doing it, I'm very aware that they're looking at something. So I'm trying to do a difficult intubation and I'm not able to get the equipment going. Then, I'm very aware that people are watching me. And then so my whole orientation becomes about impression management, about what are these people going to think about me, what's going to happen. And I'm not really paying as much attention to what it is that I'm doing. Right. So that's one that we're very familiar with. But other emotions can be of, if it's a situation where it's about delivering bad news to a parent, and we have the case, and then we have to go into a simulation and have a conversation with this parent and give bad news, and the parent is an actor who's very good at showing dismay and heartbreak and devastation. The process of emotion contagion or just being in that situation can be very difficult. So that could trigger a lot of sadness in me. Sometimes it might trigger remembering something that happened in my life previously. And so there's a lot of those different situations that, we talk a lot about anxiety, but we can trigger sadness. Um, we can trigger anger if our learners are going into a simulation and they feel like we trapped them. We feel like we didn't present them information as realistically as it happened in the real world. We feel like they feel like we trapped them to make them look bad. Then they come in and think, okay, I betrayed them. I crossed an interpersonal boundary. I disrespected them. And then they're going to come and have anger at that. So there's a lot of different ways that what we do can actually trigger, most of the time emotions that are not going to be detrimental to learning, but in some cases we might be triggering situations where the emotional state that they're in makes it that they're no longer able to engage with
Yeah.
us in the learning conversation.
And can that still be part of the training? Because, for example, in our training with ambulance personnel, uh, it happens what you just said. So we do some exercises and people feel they feel not really mistreated, but they feel like that we do too much, that it's too much, that it's too over the top or whatever, or they get frustrated, or they get frustrated just because of personal connection or with other people. We mostly say, okay, this was not the intention of the exercise, but still you recognize an emotion.
Yeah.
Is it possible to learn how to deal with it? What do you, I'm not sure if I'm correct in the question, but
Yeah. You know what? I actually think it's essential for us to do it, but it has to almost be one of our objectives as much as possible, right? I think if we have a responsibility to our learners that they learn the types of situations that they're going to be in. And if they're going to be in very high stress situations where there's not a lot of, it's kind of chaotic environments, it's uncontrolled, that is going to trigger anxiety. It might trigger some fear in some situations. And part of our responsibility is if we don't teach our learners to recognize how they feel in that moment and to develop adaptive ways of managing those emotions, then we're not really preparing them. But my argument would be is that if we're going to do that, it should almost become one of our objectives of saying, we are doing stress exposure training. We are going to do emotional activation training so that you can recognize that. Um, on the flip side, even when we don't want to, I think what you're getting at is even when we don't want necessarily to trigger those emotions, we probably still will, right? The
yeah,
nature, anybody who's been doing simulation long enough knows that learners will always surprise us. And one of the ways that they'll surprise us is their emotional reactions. I think in that moment, we can use that as an ability to say, you're right, we didn't want to trigger this. The reality is you're feeling this emotion. Could we use this as an opportunity to talk about what that does to us when we feel that way and whether or not it's going to help us or not help us and what are strategies that we could use when we're feeling that way and it's not helpful for what we're doing, right? So you could, you could then change the objectives of your conversation to say, okay, this is a performance gap, perhaps on my part, but there's a gem here that I can talk about. And what I'm hoping is that if people have learned some of the techniques in our paper, they could sit there and say, okay, let's talk about, modulation, right? What are some
yeah.
breathing exercises you can do in this situation? How can you reframe the situation? Or how do you redeploy your attention? So I think there's ways that we could do it from that perspective rather than say, I triggered emotions that I didn't want. I kind of messed up that situation.
Yeah, so I got a situation in my mind right now where a nurse is into a kind of aggression situation. Uh, and she felt like I think basically she felt it was not real and she felt a little bit too much.
Mm,
And if she perceives that as that, it's of course of course okay. But then the question becomes, we can then say, okay, you're right. Man, this is maybe too much or not real for you.
mhm.
But we can also say, because it happened already, can we learn even under these circumstances how to deal with it anyway? So it was not our intention of that exercise, but it still happened. So, but it's a little bit,
Yeah.
uh,
Well, it's an art, right? And so if you have that nurse in the situation where it triggered a little bit too much of a feeling where this nurse was threatened and felt fear, um, and then, in your debriefing either still felt that fear or maybe at this point it's become anger, right? Because you put me in a
yeah,
situation where I didn't feel safe. I think the first thing that educators would need to do and say, okay, is this emotional state of this person a place where we can have that conversation? Or do I need to help them, bring down the intensity a little bit, right? Can I make sure that they now feel safe? If they feel anger at me, that I put them in a situation where they didn't feel safe, I need to do a little bit of amends there, right? Because if she's feeling angry, it's that we crossed a boundary, right? We did something to her that was not okay. And until you address that, until she feels, I'm assuming it's a she, that she has readdressed that boundary that was crossed, that anger is going to simmer there and maybe
yeah,
not be part of that conversation. So you'd first have to recognize, okay, there's some anger there. There's some amends that need to be made. Then once that emotion is not as intense, then you could come and say, okay, you're right, we didn't want to do this, but interestingly, it did trigger something that could happen in the real world. Do you think we could have a conversation about how we manage a situation like that, both in terms of the interpersonal skills,
Yeah.
but also how do we deal with our fear because our fear can paralyze us or our fear can make us miss some things that are happening in the environment. But if there's, I'd figure out what that first emotion is, whether or not we need to support them to kind of regulate it down a bit if it's not beneficial. And then once you have them in a place where the emotions are still there, but they're engaging and they're having a conversation and you can use that as a learning moment, then I think that could be
Yeah.
incredibly powerful and supportive.
And that's the same with the difficult English word social evaluate, social evaluative. Can you please?
Social evaluative stress, yeah.
Yeah, because I learned this at the police when I was doing simulations with them. They always told me, yes, it's not the stress of this simulation per se, because we do it daily, but it is the stress of 15 colleagues watching us.
Yeah.
So I've always wondered, is this, yeah, how do you say it? Is this still honest simulation training? Because they get stress of things which are only there in this simulation, like doing your trick before all your colleagues. But or can we still say, well, as let's say, stress and emotions are just stress and emotions. So if they
Yeah.
happen,
Well, I think you have to. I think that's where as simulation educators, we really have to think about the psychological safety that we build around things, right? And so you mentioned Vic Brazel, and she says something that's incredibly powerful is that safe is not soft. And so the thing is that if they're feeling like, okay, I'm here, everybody's evaluating me. If I stumble or make a misstep, everybody's going to be judging me, then that doesn't necessarily feel like a safe environment, right? But with time, you can develop simulations where people come in with a mindset of this isn't about me proving or not losing face to colleagues, but this is about us recognizing that these are the things we deal with, recognizing that there's struggle and that we're going to co-learn with each other. You can actually see this thing where people don't make a big thing about the fact that they have emotions or the fact that they're going to stumble, right? And so
mm,
but that takes some time. That you need to build that trust. You need to build the psychological safety. And you need to build a group of individuals who say, okay, we're going to these sims in order to learn and be able to kind of develop what it is that we need to do later. I think there's always going to be a little bit of anxiety, but I think we can make that go away a little bit so that we can talk more about the other things that are happening.
yeah. Yeah, sometimes I think maybe we should get rid of that part of training to be more specific to their work. But on the other hand, in the real world, there are also people maybe watching and judging, and it's not the same, of course, maybe, but
Well, yeah, I mean, especially people that are front lines, police officers, firefighters, paramedics, they're always in
yeah.
a situation where there's the public, they're in a situation where there's the media, and they're in places, at least in North America, if they do a misstep and it's been captured by the media, it becomes front page. So there's always this awareness that I think is perhaps a little bit less in hospital because there's a little bit more control of what over
Mm.
what's happening in your environment. And so, yeah, that might be thing that, yeah, people may need to be aware that that's going to be there and they're going to have those feelings. But again, turn that into a learning
Mm.
situation of you're going to feel like you're in a spotlight, you're going to feel like you're in a fishbowl. How do we not let
Yeah,
that interfere with what we want to do?
great. Well, then in your paper, you go to how to recognize and identify emotions experienced by others. I think this is on the part of the simulation staff.
Hmm.
Uh, so how do we recognize as teachers in simulation training, how do we recognize and identify emotions by our trainees?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a very important question, right? I think one of the ways that we can do is we can ask individuals. So I know that in Canada we have a debriefing framework called the Pearls that actually has a reactions phase. And part of that phase is to ask individuals, how did that feel? How do you feel? And if you've created that environment of trust and psychological safety, a lot of the time they're actually going to tell you, and you're going to be able to do that. But you are going to have situations where people aren't going to tell you, and so there are ways to be able to recognize. So part of it is to look at facial features, whether somebody's doing a genuine smile or not. What are the subtle signs that somebody is feeling anxiety versus subtle signs that they're feeling anger? So there are facial expressions, there are voice patterns of what people will do. There's also the body language that we can learn to pay attention to. It's something that I think we all have different innate abilities to recognize that, or different kind of learned abilities to do that. But the literature suggests that this is something that we can learn to pay attention to, and we can learn to recognize the signs. And so part of it is sometimes just attuning ourselves to, okay, what are the signs that somebody's happy? What are the signs that somebody is angry? And I can say that since I've been doing this research, I've become better at being able to recognize the emotional states that people are in. The third one, that I guess the last one that some people are looking at, is, well, can we use physiology, right? Can we strap sensors onto them and take a look at it? And other than for stress, which we can see things like heart rate variability, or the other ones, all of the other measures aren't very sensitive to different emotions, right? You can get increase in heart rate if somebody is excited, as if they're angry, as
Yeah.
if they're anxious. So physiology is not there, other than if we want to look at stress, but it's not really feasible to put chest straps on all of our learners and say, hey, I think you're being stressed, I think you're not. I mean, sometimes you can, but in the moment, the question is, how helpful can it be?
So what would be the best thing for us to do for our simulation staff on the basis of what you just told? We can use a debriefing framework like Pearls. What is Pearls, by the way? Can you what is the format looking like? Pearls framework.
What does the framework look like?
Yeah, yeah. Do you
Yeah,
know
so
that?
the Pearls framework, and I should know what Pearls stand for, but we only use it. And so it's developed by a number of colleagues, Adam Chang, Vince Grant, Walter Epic is part of this. And what it does, it's a framework that comes in that it's a framework for doing a debriefing to help
Hmm.
give structure and help decide. And so the first part is a reactions phase of doing a little bit of an emotional diagnostic, right? How did that feel? How does everybody feel? And it's meant for two things. One is to normalize the fact that people are going to have emotional reactions, and the other one is to a little bit of a diagnostic, right? Are there strong feelings here that perhaps could impede the learning? So that's the first
Yeah,
phase. The second is a descriptive phase to get everybody on the same page of, okay, what was this scenario? And then you go into the analysis phase, which is to analyze and discuss and hopefully resolve the different performance gaps that you would have observed. And it gives different strategies. So the first strategy is directive feedback of, you've observed something, you want to close the performance gap, you simply give your advice. Next time you should hold the learning
yeah,
scope this way because. Another strategy is the plus delta. What are the things that went well? What are the things that could be done differently? And then you're bringing in the learners a little bit into sort of self-evaluation. And then the last one is advocacy inquiries, that you've observed a gap, and you want to bring it up and the learners haven't brought it up. It's you share what your observation is, you share your judgment. I saw that you did this. It concerned me because of this. And then you come in with genuine curiosity, as tell me a little bit more about how that was from your perspective. So it gives you guidelines for different
yeah,
types of analysis. And then it goes into a summary phase of what is it that then that you would take away from this. So it's sort of, I think it's a little similar to the
yeah,
diamond strategy, but it's a framework that gives you different approaches, gives you structure first of all, and it gives you
yeah.
different approaches that you can try.
So in relationship with emotions in simulation training, or staff members can use that framework to
They
identify emotions and to for self-reporting emotions.
they can. But interestingly, one of the reasons that we wrote these two papers is, I've spent the last 10 years teaching sim educators and watching how people do this reactions phase. And I always felt that people weren't quite equipped with what to do when the emotions come out. So we see a
Mm.
lot of people do the reactions phase, there's strong emotions that come up, and then you see that the facilitator's a little bit like, oh, there's some heavy stuff or important stuff that's come here. I don't know what to do with that. And so this is meant to a little bit, maybe supplement or give additional resources to learners that, or to our facilitators, that when you see those emotions and you think they're not adaptive, what are some strategies that you can try to regulate and support the learner so that they're going to be in a state where they can do the learning, right? And one of the things that we say it's very important is it's not to get rid of emotions that are uncomfortable, because sometimes uncomfortable emotions can be good for learning, right? It's really about figuring out those emotions that put the learner in a state where they're not going to be able to learn as part of the discussion.
So, what are the strategies you advocate in the paper for us as sim educators? So, let's say, for example, I'm in a simulation, and what happens mostly with me, I get all the emotions, by the way. Let's say I'm becoming a little bit frustrated or angry.
Yeah.
What could our staff members do if they see that?
Getting
What?
angry during the simulation or angry during the debriefing?
No, during the simulation, so I get frustrated or angry. It doesn't matter. It can also be anxiety, and they know,
Yeah.
and the staff notice it. What are some strategies to deal with it?
Yeah. If it's during the scenario and they're still able to do the scenario, I would likely let it play out. But then when I would come in the debriefing, I would make that probably one of my points of conversation of saying, I noticed that there seemed to be frustration, right? That people were talking a little bit sharply. I'm curious about what was happening there and how, as a team, you dealt with it. And so I would make that an explicit point of discussion in my debriefing to a little bit normalize it and say, it is going to happen that you're going to get angry. It is going to happen that you're going to get anxious. So, as individuals or as teams, how do we navigate those situations? Right. So, it's not to say, oh, I have to get rid of that. It's more of, it's going to happen. How do I have these conversations that are recognizing it, validating it, and giving them the skills that they can use, rather than this idea of, oh, they got angry, it's bad, we shouldn't get angry. Because if
Yeah.
I do that, I'm giving the message that emotions are bad and that they should be suppressed or avoided, and that's not beneficial for anyone.
And then you, in your article, you, if I'm correctly, you um, make some explicit and implicit, um, is it correct?
Strategies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
regulation strategies. So these are the strategies we as sim educators learn our students. Is that what this is?
Yeah, the article is written more in terms of strategies that we can use as educators to do extrinsic regulation, right, to regulate the emotions of others. But
Hmm.
there are all strategies that we can use for ourselves as well,
Yeah.
right? So I can do attention deployment by myself. I use a lot of reframing, right? If I go into a situation where I'm feeling this feeling of anxiety, I do this little self-talk of how I
Yeah.
reframe the situation. So all these strategies we can use ourselves. The article is written from the perspective of what the facilitator can do to regulate others' emotions. Um, and I wish we had been a little bit more explicit to say these are also things that we can teach individuals. But we do have in in one of our plans is to write another paper of how we can use simulation for for the purposes of teaching people to recognize their emotions and navigate their emotions, right? So stress exposure is
Yeah.
one of them, but what are other strategies that we can do that? So there are loose plans of having a third paper of using sim for emotion regulation training for the learners to develop their emotion regulation
Well,
strategy.
that's great because that's exactly the goal of our training to learn our students. These are just the nurses and doctors and police officers to self-regulate.
Yeah,
And we have a three-phase. We have the self-regulation with the task regulation and the co-regulation.
yeah,
So the self-regulation speaks for itself.
yeah,
So breathing techniques, reframing, and others. And then the task regulation is more how to, if your attention is going away, how to bring it back.
yeah.
And the third one, co-regulation, which I come to the conclusion is maybe the most important one, is just especially as a team leader to be calm and collected and to have how you calm energy about you
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so
Or even to create a sense of urgency in your team if your team is not recognizing that this is an urgent situation,
yeah,
right? Like this idea of, yeah, how to recognize where the others are and the things we can do to up or down regulate
yeah.
according to the task that we're in.
Can you talk a little bit about the strategies you talk about in the paper? So there are affect labeling, emotion, contagion, attentional deployment, and the other ones, the implicit and explicit. Can you just give a little overview about it?
Yeah, you'll have to dial me in if I go too deep into it because I'm very
No.
passionate. Yeah, so there's implicit strategies that we can do that can influence others, right? So one of the first one is emotion contagion, right? If I come into a situation and I'm in a very bad mood and I'm very angry, other people are going to catch a little bit of that. Whereas if I come in and I'm feeling generally pleasant and generally warm, that is going to influence what other people are thinking. So that's one thing we can think about. And the idea here is not to come in and always be a little bit, toxic positivity of like everything's great, everything's wonderful. But it can take sort of an open, curious approach. And so that can be one strategy that can be implicit. The other one is affect labeling. There's a lot of research that shows that simply naming the emotional state that we're in can downregulate it. And that's what we essentially do in things like the reactions phase of Pearl, right? Of getting people to say, well, I felt pretty anxious or I'm feeling a little stressed. Simply naming that has a process of downregulating it. Except with anger, anger is one of the rare emotions that if we focus on it, it actually tends to kind of feed on itself. So anger is one that we always have to, anger is one of those emotions that's everything you learn about emotions, anger is a little bit different.
So I
Uh,
feel angry and I feel even more angry right now because I'm
yeah,
feeling
and then I'm
angry.
just
Yeah.
gonna get worse and yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so there's some implicit ones that we can do there. And so it's just a lot of just subtle things you do. Then the explicit ones is it's very specifically of saying, okay, this person's in this emotional state. I want them to be in this target state. And I'm going to strategically try to change what it is that they are doing or how they're approaching it. So attention deployment is they're really focused on this part of the crisis that they didn't deal well and they're a little bit obsessed is the idea, well, there's a lot of parts that went really well. Let's push their attention to this
Mm.
other situation, talk about that first. And then we can come back to the thing where, the attention is not going to be, the emotion is not going to be as strong for that. And so just pulling,
Yeah.
kind of unsticking them from where they're looking at. That's really good for very strong emotions. Then there's the idea of cognitive reappraisal or reframing. It's getting individuals to view a situation differently. And so, the idea of, I made a mistake, I messed up, or it could be, well, could it be that isn't it great that we did this in simulation? Because then we can learn the strategies. You change the implications of what's happening, or you change the expectations on yourself. That's not so good when people are in a very, very strong emotional state because you can't unstick their thoughts. So that one's a little bit, you do that when it's not as an intense of an emotion. The third one is modulation, where you try to get people to change what they're feeling, right? Let's go for a walk. Let's take a deep breath. Let's think about some square breathing as you're just trying to modulate the physiological arousal perspectives of it. And then the last one is just change the situation,
Mm.
situation modification of, like you said, you have learners that are in a scenario, they're very angry, they're very upset. If they're still able to get through, then you can let the scenario play out. But let's say your learners are really junior and they're so overwhelmed and they're so stressed that this is just not productive and you see that it's a little bit of spiraling, then change that modification. Go in and stop the scenario and say, I notice that this seems to be happening. Do we do a reset? Do we want to talk about what's happening here? And do it in a way that doesn't shame them, but do it in a way that
Mm.
normalizes that this is going to happen in a situation where things are just too crazy or you're just, you're spinning. How can you catch that? What can you do when you're in that situation? Um, and then you can do it. Or they did a scenario and they're really angry because they think you trapped them, and you know that you've tried everything else and they're still really not happy. Then you can say, okay, why don't we stop this debriefing, and do we want to redo the scenario? Right. So you change the situation to
Yeah.
remove the things that are triggering the strong emotions. So that's sort of a little bit of a quick overview of the different strategies that we can use.
And you talk about it, of course, in the paper, but how do we know? I'm a psychologist myself, so I studied it for a long time, but not everybody, and I even want to make the impression that I understand it, but
Yeah.
but for people who are not psychologists or have done a lot of study in it, how do you know as an educator when the emotion is too much or not in according with the goals? How is there a method to that?
Yeah, this is where it becomes, I would say it becomes a little bit more of an art. Is, I think we can all know when our learners are having there's something happening, and it's the way that you can know is, are they engaging, right? Because you might have somebody who's angry, but they're still having a conversation, right? They're still
Yeah.
engaging with you when you're trying to work with them to say, okay, what are different strategies that we could try? Or, and they're still doing it, but they're angry. Then that's not an emotion that's misaligned, right? Whereas they might be in a situation where there's something and you're trying to engage them and you're trying to get them to do stuff, and they're giving you one word answers. They're not participating. Similarly, as if they have a lot of anxiety and you're trying to get them in a problem solving state, and they're like, I don't know what I would do. I don't know. And so a lot of it is going to be that they're not engaging with you. They're not
Yeah.
engaging with the problem, because their emotional state has them a little bit oriented differently, and doing so. A lot of the time we know. I think we know that our learners are not in a place where we're having that conversation. And the focus on this is to say, okay, what are some strategies that we can do in that case?
Do you think performance itself could be a good starting point um, to recognize if the emotions are helping or not? So for example, in our medical simulations, we let them do resuscitation simulations.
Right.
If there is a performance gap, maybe that's a good starting point. It can also be skill based, of course. Eh?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is you have to know, is it that they just don't know the skill, or is it
Yeah.
that they know the skill and can't do it? And when I think about when I worked with the flight paramedics, that was a cue for us. That was one of the first cues. I would do write outs in the helicopter, and we would land on busy highways, and they would help take care of patients that they're extracting from cars, right? I saw the level of performance they could do. Then we'd bring them in the simulator, which was like a helicopter, had the sound of a helicopter and everything. And they're going through their bags that are all packed in a systematic way, but they couldn't find things anymore. Or they're trying to do an intubation and suddenly they're not able to do an intubation. And people that, when I did write outs, I knew that they could do that. So that's actually what triggered it. It was, there's something happening here. I know that these people can do that. So what's this phenomenon at place that suddenly all this ability to plan and do everything was a little bit out the window. And so that was actually the first hint that I did. So sometimes you can, if you know that these people are capable and they have the skills and they have the knowledge, and they're not, then emotions would be one of the things that I would think about, right? Because it might be communication breakdown between the
Yeah.
team,
Yeah.
but it might be emotions. And so it's just bringing that awareness of like, okay, there might be something else that's here, and we turn that into performance gaps that we can then teach and support them to know, okay, when that happens again, how could you manage it?
Do you think is it a good idea to intervene in scenarios when you see, for example, in the last time I did a 2 day scenario with doctors, if I remember correctly, they had to step up individually and perform a certain case, and I saw 3 or 4 people, a little bit like they went offline. It was not freezing, but their non-verbal, their body language, they were not
Yeah.
engaged anymore. And we can wait and we can wait till the scenario is over, simulation is over, but it seems also a great moment to intervene and take a picture and say, what's happening here? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts about it?
I'm actually open to it. I know that there's sort of the general consensus, at least in health in healthcare simulation, of let the scenario play out because you want to give them a chance to kind of recover and bring things back. But if part of what we're attending to is the emotional reactions and how the emotional reactions can help or sometimes don't help, then could we use this as a bit of kind of a variation on biofeedback, right? It's
Yeah,
not their
exactly.
biology, it's not their biofeedback that's telling you, but and if you make that part of like I think you have to normalize that that's what you might do, right? Because you don't want to go in a situation where like, okay, we see that you're freezing, we're going to interrupt because you don't want to shame them. You
Yeah.
don't want them to think, oh, I messed up. But if it's specifically and you set it up that we're going to do a strategy where if we see things that are going, you're still doing okay, but it's not great, we're going to interrupt, have a conversation, and then restart it. And there's a sim strategy called live, die, repeat that
Mm.
people do that, the specific strategies. And if you make that part of it and say, okay, how's everybody feeling right now? And you've created that environment where they feel safe, they'd be like, I am so over my head. Okay, what do we do in a situation like this? How do we get ourselves back and everything? And you turn that into a learning moment there. So it's I say biofeedback because it's the idea of you're
Yeah,
flagging
I
for them,
understand.
but
Yeah.
I think that there's great potential in doing it from
Yeah.
that perspective, as long as
Yeah.
we're not shaming them or humiliating them because we've kind
Yeah.
of stopped. So you'd have to build the structure around it.
Let's talk about debriefing because I'm a little bit confused.
Okay.
Because there is a kind of research that it's not good to go too deep into emotions if people have experienced, how do you call it? Sorry, now my English is leaving me a little bit.
Trauma.
Yeah, trauma, but also after heavy incidents in real life, but also, of course, in simulation. So maybe I wrestle with that because sometimes people can be triggered in
Yeah.
simulations. You don't know what is the trigger. It can be a previous experience.
Yeah.
And how far can we go, especially if we don't have the knowledge and opportunities to.
Yeah. And this is really critical. And actually, these are conversations that Glenn and Vic and I had when we were writing the paper, right? Because the idea is this we're not encouraging people to go into therapy, right? we are
Exactly.
not
Yeah.
we are not psychotherapists. We cannot delve into the traumatic things that we've done. What we can do though is be attentive to say, what are the emotional underpinnings that are happening here? Are they adaptive to the situation? Are they not? If they're not, then we have to do something about it. And so something about it may be to get them to reframe or attention deployment. But we can also attend to say there's something pretty deep there. Like I think this person has been re-triggered. I think that the level of emotions that they're having are so strong or so not linked with what we want to do. That in a case like this, I wouldn't start talking with the individual. I would do situation modification and say, okay, maybe this person needs to step out and we need to make sure that this person's going to have some follow-up, right? So the idea is not to go in and to be a therapist and tell me about all your deep feelings and we're going to spend an hour of group debrief here. It's more of getting people to be attuned to what's happening. Is it adaptive? Is it not? If it's not, are there strategies that I can do to kind of bring them back? But it's also going to make it that we attune to whether or not somebody's at risk of being damaged, right? Because I think right now, by not thinking about emotions and not delving into it, we're not attentive to those situations, right? So we may have traumatized them. We have may put them in a situation that re-triggered something that happened before, but we're not paying attention to it and we haven't recognized it. And that person is just going to go away and relive it and ruminate and do all of those things
Yeah.
that we're worried about the re-traumatization. Where the idea around what we're advocating is if you're attentive and you look at it, you should be better at recognizing those. But when you recognize that situation, we don't have the skills. We're not therapists,
Yeah.
but we can recognize it and hopefully pull them out of that situation, get them the support that they're going to need.
So would a good goal be that in the simulation as educators we try to figure out if it's adaptive or not, and then maybe have a little conversation about that, but not going into a great length, and, and learn, of course, some strategies ourselves, as educators, and also our students.
Yeah, absolutely, right? That's the really idea of it is
Yeah.
learning a little bit to, like you say, is it adaptive or is it not adaptive? Trying to bring them back if it's a strong emotion. And if they're open to it, having conversation, okay, look, we are going to have emotions. What do we do? What are
Yeah.
adaptive ways that we can deal with emotions, right? Almost normalize it rather than say, emotions are uncomfortable, we're going to push them aside. Is we bring it out in the open and say, you are going to be angry at some patients, right? You are going to be sad at things that happened. You are going to have anxiety. And what are some strategies you can do when you feel like those emotions are not adaptive to what it is that you want to do, right? And I think if we do
Yeah.
that, we're going to better support them. But yeah, we have to draw the line at if we've re-triggered them or at risk of re-triggering them, we don't have the skill set to go there.
With regard to emotions, I think 3 or 4 years. No, no. Let's say we for a long time here in the Netherlands used a model. I think it was called the triune brain, with a lizard brain. The and it was a kind of simple model, but
Yeah.
5 years ago, our whole emotion theory was was going astray because of the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett,
Mm,
and her theory of constructed emotion, where she says that there are no universal emotions.
mm,
You cannot see it. There are no universal expressions. Emotions are not reactions but predictions. Well, there's a lot in her books and in the research to read. But what we also did was to use, I'm not sure if she developed it, but the, how do you call it, the framework with the arousal, yeah, low arousal, high arousal, and the valence.
oh, the circumplex. Yeah, the circumplex model of emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
on the basis of her theory, emotions are constructed by culture and language and so on. So what we took away from it was also to learn our trainees to develop what we call emotional vocabulary.
Okay.
Because sometimes when I ask nurses or doctors or police officers, and I see them performing is not going well, and I ask them, what did you feel? How do you feel? And so on. And they just can't find the words.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, if we use that framework and we go a little bit deep, but are you low arousal, high arousal? And then the wonder appears. I had a nurse, a woman, standing at a terrorist attack simulation kind of thing, and she
Yeah.
was a little bit freezing up. I asked her about her feelings, and she felt nothing, she said, and she didn't know what she felt, and so on. And then I was looking with her, and the word that I found was, how do you call it? A kind of helplessness.
Yeah.
That was the word I give to her. Say this, but does it feel like whatever you do, it doesn't make the situation better? And then she clicked in on that word, and she began to smile, and she recognized. She said, "That's exactly."
Yeah.
So my point is, what do you think about developing more words for our emotions?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because what you've just described is you did affect labeling. You
Hmm.
helped her put a label to it. And once she could label it, that sort of it
Yeah.
deflated it. I think, there's so much in what you've just said. I'm trying to think what it is that I want to chat about, right? Because
Yeah.
Um, going back to the first thing, right? The idea of the lizard brain and the other brain, I think that's what we're trying to move away from, right?
Yeah.
This idea that emotions are part of our primitive brain and emotions always sort of derail us. That's not true. Emotions are so critical for our survival as social beings, as physical beings, that we have to recognize they're there for a reason, right? We have emotional reactions for a reason, and it tells our system good, bad, control, no control. Um, as for, how to help people identify emotions, I agree. I think we have societies that value reason over emotions, and a lot of the implicit messages that we get are to suppress and to avoid emotions. So we never really learn to recognize them. We never really learn to kind of label them. We just have a lot of feels bad, push aside. and a lot of this stuff. And so I think coming up with strategies, like you say, right, whether it's the circumplex model that has positive, negative, plus or minus arousal, other people will use emoticons, right? They'll have the little yellow faces and stuff to be able to recognize. Other people, there's things called the emotion wheel. Sometimes that can be helpful to help people recognize what it is that that emotion is, because like you've shown, just being able to recognize it and name it, and in case kind of validate it as well, right? Not say, oh,
Yeah.
that's bad. It's like, okay, that's what you did. I think we can help our learners do that. And so there are ways that we can give them the language, the tool, the colors, the images that they need to recognize that. But I think we can also learn how to recognize the different emotions, right? You recognize that she had helplessness because you had the experience of putting people in situations where they're emotional and thinking about it and developing it, right? So I think it can both ways.
Yeah.
We can teach them to recognize it, but we can also learn to recognize it in other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. By the way, I just received this book. Let me. It just was just coming out recently.
Okay, shift. Okay.
It's from Ethan. Oh,
Move.
sorry, Ethan Cross.
Okay. Oh, I don't
Uh,
know about that one. Oh, I'm gonna have to get that one.
yeah, it's great. He had his book before was like this book. Sorry. Um. Oh, sorry. Chatter.
Right.
He's a professor in. I'm not sure where he's done a lot of research into emotions. I'm not.
Okay.
I did not read it right now, but well, there's a lot of interest in emotions. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, I'm just sending myself a text,
Yeah.
so apology to your
No,
listeners.
no. Yeah.
The good thing about these types of things is the more you chat with people that are interested in this topic, the more we're learning. Um, and I think we are seeing a cultural change, right? Like you said, we used to kind of think, the lizard brain and emotions are bad. And I think collectively we're developing a little bit more sophistication how we're thinking about emotions and recognizing they're there. They're there for a reason. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not, but we owe it to ourselves to recognize this. And when they are helpful, how do
Yeah.
we marshal them? And when they're not helpful, rather than just automatically saying, okay, those need to be put in a box and put away, to actually go in and spend some time with it of like, why do we have that emotion? What way is it helpful or not helpful? And what can we do when it's not helpful? And so
Yeah.
I love that we're actually having these conversations, because 10 years ago, we were not having these conversations.
No, even today, even in the from police perspective, we called it the soft sector, the nurses and so on. But even there, to ask, how do you feel? Uh, Sometimes people, especially men, if I'm not politically correctly, but they look at me like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But,
You know,
but yeah,
there's men, but there's also, I mean, we can go into the gender thing, but there's also a thing as women, right? Like if I go in a situation as a woman and I show tears, oh no, here I go. They're just going to think that I'm a crying woman. But yeah, there are still microcultures where that's not very valued, right? Like for example, I'm really big into police shows lately, right? Because
Mhm.
I just turn off the brain and I watch police shows. But I was watching an episode yesterday where it's a police rookie and they're talking about what they struggle and what's going on in their life. And they're simply told by their training officer, yeah, we all have that. You just need to shut it down. You just need to put it aside and shut it down. And I'm like, right, there is a perfect example of just suppression and avoidance. Whereas as a emotions researcher, I'm like, that could have been such a great learning moment of like, we all struggle with this, but here's how we can manage to do all of this stuff, right? And
Yeah.
so even then, I can't turn off my emotions researcher brain when I'm trying to watch TV and just sort of turn off the world. So,
And what do you think, by the way, about dealing with emotions from a operational perspective? So, for example, if I talk with surgeons or doctors, they say to me, and also police officers or military, they say that sometimes to perform their job, they have to, yeah, how do you call it, to be a little bit more instrumental and shutting down their emotions,
yeah.
because, well, if you have to operate as a neurosurgeon, a child or and so on. But my question then is, when when do you open up and when do you close the door?
Yeah. And I
Or
think that's
yeah,
where And I think that's where if the whole message is to say, yeah, you're going to have that, but you need to shut it down, and that's the only messages that you do, and that's all that you learn, and you're always shutting down, right? You're doing suppression, you're doing avoidance.
yeah,
We know that you have a greater likelihood of having mental health issues, right? You're more likely to be burnt out. You're most likely to have post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety. You're more likely also to have physical health, right? There is some links between suppression, avoidant type coping, and cardiovascular incidents. Um, they're trying to understand basically the way that you form plaques and the way that plaques get released are linked with the way that you manage stress. And so I think the issue, I think, is having a little bit more sophisticated conversations around it and say, look, there are times where if you're too stressed or you're too anxious about what it is that you're doing, that's going to harm you, right? So you have to become very task focused, very task oriented. What are the next steps that I need to do? But at some point, you have to have a conversation with somebody. You have to do this.
yeah.
And I learned that a lot with when I would do ride outs with paramedics, right? Part of what they do is the horror stories, right? They have shifts and they go out, and oftentimes it's with drinks and it's social situation. And it's all trying to compare what are the things that they've seen. And this is a way that they use social support to do that. Now we know that in a lot of first responders, there's also high levels of trauma and high level of substance abuse. And so but could we take what's happening there and actually do it at an organizational level in a way that actually is adaptive, is helpful, and normalizes it, and not just something you talk about when you're having beers with some
Yeah.
buddies? I think that's where organizations can become a little bit more supportive of it.
I think what I've learned in my own life is that you can avoid and suppress, or you can avoid and suppress, or not thinking about feelings, or not feel, or even not feeling, but in the end, they still reside. It feels like a kind of energy in my physiology that it comes, yeah, or you have to work at 24/7 till the day you die. But
Yeah, it's like a pressure cooker, right? There's actually
yeah,
some research that has looked at avoidant coping styles and reframing, and they find that if you can do reframing, um, not only is it better for adjusting the emotion, but you're actually going to remember more or learn more from that situation. Whereas a lot of avoidant coping style, it's like a pressure cooker that you have to use cognitive resources to keep them at bay. It's an active thing
exactly.
of
Yeah,
holding them. And but physiologically, you're still having that response, right? So it's actually requiring a lot of resources to not think about those emotions. And when they do pop up or they do come in, they're usually very powerful, right? And so that's why with things with post-traumatic stress, you have things like intrusion or things like that because you keep them at bay so much that when they finally get out, they're huge.
huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I forget to ask you a question, or do you have any advice to me and my simulation colleague educators on the basis of your research?
Um, I guess the advice that I would say is, we don't know all of the answers. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to have situations where it's an emotional situation that, just didn't go well. But I think if we just switch our focus to the idea of recognizing that emotions are there, accepting that emotions are there, and validating the fact that our emotions are there, sort of as our gestalt of doing it, it puts us in a better place to be able to say, okay, what's happening to my learners? What's happening to me? Is it adaptive? Is it not adaptive? And what are some strategies that I can use when it's not adaptive? I think that if we can do that, and then we develop more comfort with the discomfort of emotions, right? Just like, okay, this is not a comfortable situation, right? People are mad at me. I don't like this, but let's just sit with that discomfort. I think it's a subtle mindset. It's a shift in mindset, but it's an important shift in mindset that I think if we do that, we're better going to be able to support our learners learning in the sim. But I think we can then start embedding, teaching them to not fear their emotions, not suppress them, and then it's going to be helpful as they're going into those clinical situations because clinical care is emotional, and if we don't help individuals learn to recognize that and do adaptive regulation to it, we're essentially setting them up to kind of harm themselves and potentially not be able to give the best care to patients. And we might not want them to be there, but they're going to be there. It's like the weather. You might not want the rain, but the rain is beneficial and it is going to show up, and we need to learn how to drive in the rain. In Canada, we need to learn to drive in snowstorms. I
Yeah.
can't just ignore that, we had 70 centimeters of snow that fell in the last 3 weeks, right? And so
Well, that sounds as great advice. My last question? What are your ambitions with this line of research?
oh boy. Part of it is to continue doing some research. We're doing some research now where we can track just in time stress reactions, and so we're trying to understand what is it that triggers stress in the moment and who's more likely to get stressed, and sort of kind of get a picture of that. And like I said, one of the papers that we have in mind for writing is a general idea of how we can use simulation for the purposes of helping learners recognize and manage their emotions in an adaptive way. And so stress exposure is one of them, but other ways as well. And I'm also very interested in looking at, so far I've looked very much at emotions inside the individual, but what's the interpersonal, what's the social way that emotions are? And you mentioned it earlier, right? This idea of co-regulation.
Yeah,
What happens to teams? What happens to groups? And how do groups how does that group think kind of affect it? So,
great.
and that's just the first three things that came to mind, but there's so much still to be done in this area. I'm never retiring. I'm just going to keep looking into the topic.
Yeah, and we the same. Well, thank you so much for your time in this research. And is it possible to put the articles at the show notes, or are these behind how do you call it?
They're not
Behind.
behind firewalls. No, I think we explicitly published these papers in a journal that has open access,
Okay.
so that they would be openly available. So absolutely, they can. I don't think that there's any restrictions for sharing them.
Well, thank you so much. I will end this session, then I will say goodbye to you offline. So don't go away immediately. Thank you for listening to this podcast about emotional regulation strategies for simulation-based education. I learned a lot. We learned a lot, I think. And until next time. Bye bye,
Thank you
Vicky.
so much. Thank you so much for giving me a platform to talk about this
Yeah,
important topic.
great.